Now, let me indicate to members, you might recall some discussion, those of you who are on the Rules Committee, of whether or not there, and we had this discussion on the floor as well, whether or not there was a fiscal note relative to this bill. There was a preliminary fiscal note, and there was indication, and I'm one of the people who stated it, that we have not based legislation on preliminary fiscal notes. A fiscal note did show up on the bill. Senator Dibble then moved to have the bill sent back to the Finance Committee for purposes of the consideration of the fiscal note. And obviously we have some policy in this bill, but Senator Dibble, I know the bill has been considered in the Judiciary Committee, which I serve on, Senator Latz's committee, and we do want to have a couple minutes discussion of the fiscal note and the need for the fiscal note, why the fiscal note. Senator Dibble.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. I believe the fiscal note is in your packet in front of you, clipped to the bill. 35 pages long. I have some folks here. So I have Nathan Morocco and Michelle Weber here from MMB, who can explain both the cost side as well as the revenue side. The short version is that much of the costs are distributed across all state agencies or many state agencies by their analysis that about 114 folks, couples will get married who are in state employment, and then they'll of course have family members on the CGIP, on the State Employee Group Insurance Plan, and then of course when folks get married and when folks get divorced, they pay fees, and so that's attributable to some general fund revenues. The costs, of course, come from general fund as well as a number of other special revenue sources, like the Department of Transportation, for example. Their employees are paid out of the highway fund, so it's hard to really know with great precision where exactly the funds that we need to expend come from. This is in context, of course, and I think the employee benefits program itself is a $600 and some million endeavor, and we're talking about $630,000 approximately in fiscal year 14 and $688 in 15. With that, Mr. Chair, maybe Mr. Morocco can shed a little bit more light on the fiscal note, and then Ms. Weber can talk about some of the revenue that's generated.
Sure. If we could have a couple of minutes on the fiscal note, whoever would like to begin.
Sure, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, for the record, my name is Nathan Morocco. I'm the director of the Employee Insurance Division. I oversee the state's employee group insurance program. I think actually Senator Dibble did an excellent job of providing the overview of the fiscal impact. We would assume approximately 114 members would come onto the plan. Obviously, as members come on, they're going to incur more services to the plan, and that equates to roughly $631,000 per year. So with that, Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Any questions for Mr. Morocco on the fiscal note? Senator Westrom.
Mr. Chair, 114, pretty precise number. How do you come up with that number?
Mr. Chair and Senator Westrom, the calculation is actually in the fiscal note, so we're using basic demographic data in terms of how many households in the state are currently unmarried and are currently of the same sex. And then we make some assumptions relative to what our current enrollment experiences are. And so, again, that is laid out in the fiscal note. But it is similar to the assumptions and actually the experience that we had back in 2003 when we did have a very brief period of offering domestic partner benefits in the state employee group insurance program. But it is, to your point, it is an estimate. Based on what we're seeing for demographic information from the state demographers.
Sir Newman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Morocco, to follow up on Senator Westrom's question, when I look at the fiscal note, it looks like you're talking about a range of between 132 and 153, and from there you extrapolated and came up with 114. Again, tell me, what's the source of the information that gives you the range of 132 to 153? And I'm looking at page 4, the last paragraph of the fiscal note, if that'll help you.
Sure, Mr. Chair and Senator. So the demographic information in terms of how many folks in Minnesota are living both together as unmarried, opposite, and same-sex couples that is listed in the paragraph above in the 2010 U.S. Census data. And so we do come up with a range, and we're simply just picking the midpoint of that range based on the census data. And then we are assuming, just like opposite sex couples today in the CGIT program, not everyone who is married elects to cover their spouse. So we're roughly at about, I think it's about 76%, 76.69% of current CGIT opposite sex spouses choose to cover that spouse, so roughly 23% choose not to. So that's why we then reduce, even though there may be same-sex couples in Minnesota, they may not necessarily choose to cover that same-sex spouse. And so we're simply making that, we're dropping then the number of eligibles to what we believe would actually be enrolled in the program. Again, it is an estimate, admittedly, and we're just trying to base it on our current experience in CGIT.
Thank you, Mr. Morocco. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, Mr.
Senator Dibble.
Mr. Chair, I think, and maybe Mr. Morocco can correct me if I'm wrong, I also know that the state had at least a brief experience when they provided health care benefits to domestic partners back in the Ventura administration. And I think there's some data that informs this fiscal note from that 1-year period of time. Is that correct?
Mr. Chair and Senator Dibble, that is correct. We don't actually reference that in here, but we certainly apply sort of a reasonable test to this analysis, and it's similar to what we had experienced or what we would have expected back in 2003.
Did he say reasonable?
Okay. Further questions for Mr. Morocco?
Mr. Chair.
I'm sorry, Senator Limmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Senator Dibble, maybe you or your guests there can answer some questions. I noticed that as I looked through the fiscal note, there was no reference to judiciary budgets. Now, if we're expanding the number of marriages that in the state of Minnesota, we would also be expanding the court costs involving divorces, child custody, property resolution. Why isn't that included in the fiscal note?
Mr. Chair, I think Ms. Weber can help us.
Ms. Weber.
Mr. Chair and members, my name is Michelle Weber. I'm the Director of Budget Operations at Minnesota Management and Budget. And the courts were not asked to respond explicitly to this fiscal note. And so that's why there's nothing reflected related to them.
Mr. Chair, why not?
Mr. Chair and members, in the analysis of the original bill, in doing the assignment and the discussions that had occurred, we had primarily focused on the insurance costs as well as the marriage license fees. So had not taken the potential court costs into consideration.
Mr. Chair, I remember when we had discussed this on the Senate floor a number of weeks back, and I wanted to thank you for having this hearing today. You're living up to your reputation, Mr. Chair.
Well, I'm happy to do that for you.
I always like to sell the chair if I can.
It'll take a lot more than that, Senator Limmer, but go ahead.
Senator Ingebrigtsen said not to overdo it, so I'll take his advice. But I do remember specifically raising this discussion on the Senate floor about the cost of judiciary. I would have hoped that someone that was going to do the finance analysis would have picked up on that subtle hint of about 3 minutes of discussion on the Senate floor. The other question I had of MMB is you made a reference on page 6 of local government impact, and didn't have much of a dollar amount that's recognized, and I was wondering if you could expand on that, of why that is not a definite accounting of costs.
Ms. Weber.
Mr. Chair and Senator Limmer, the local government impact, there is a separate process for requesting a local government note that is not governed by the fiscal note process. The fiscal note process is intended to be reflective of the state agency impacts and costs, not the local government. We do, however, discuss the potential cost to local governments. And so in this fiscal note, have discussed it, but we traditionally do not quantify the costs of local governments. That's done through a separate process.
And, Mr. Chair, could you tell me what that separate process is?
Mr. Chair and Senator Limmer, it is a local impact note that can be requested.
And Senator Limmer, just in response to your question, I've commented where we've had division chairs presenting omnibus bills to us with other preceding division chairs. In this instance, obviously, you chaired the committee that had jurisdiction over the courts. I've chaired previously in past chairmanships the division that's had jurisdiction of the courts. Senator Latz now has jurisdiction. And obviously, when we've had changes in law, whether it be family law, criminal law, whatever the law might be, we've never taken that into consideration in the fiscal note. It becomes reflected in requests from the judiciary for additional judgeships usually. And I think, obviously, I'm not sure when you chaired for the previous 2 years if we weren't in the process of adding judgeships, I don't think. But I know when I chaired state departments previously with jurisdiction over the courts, there were requests for additional judgeships. And so if there were to be a significant amount of new activity, say in the family court as a consequence of this, that cannot be handled by the current complement of judges, if there was some significant change, I assume it would be reflected in a further request from the Supreme Court for new judgeships in whatever district. So normally that's how that's been handled, and whether it be this issue or where we've made changes in the criminal law, certainly. Senator Nino.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, based on that line of questioning and the response that the courts were not asked, and I think it's fair to assume that if we're going to have more marriages, we're going to have more divorces, and there will be more, court costs, et cetera. Given the concern over my amendment that was pulled out of the previous bill, my assumption is, Mr. Chair, that you're going to lay this over until we can get that information from the courts. Is that correct?
Well, in this case, we have a very complete fiscal note in front of us that was requested, so we've had a response from...
Mr. Chair, but we didn't get a response from the courts because they weren't asked. And there might, to use the words of Mr. Nauman, there might or might not be a cost, and that should be a concern for us based on my amendment.
Senator Nino, I guess I would suggest that unlike your amendment, which came up within the past hour and a half, this is a bill that has been before the legislature since...
But not this committee.
Well, not this committee, but it's. But if you'll let me finish, this is a bill that's been before the legislature since almost the start of the session, and so if there's been a desire for fiscal notes from MMB, from the Supreme Court, a local impact statement, whatever, there has been months of opportunity to do that.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Nino.
As you might recall, Senator Limmer and I tried to get this bill to this committee weeks ago, and you opposed it.
And that was based upon a preliminary fiscal note and not the fiscal note we have in front of us. And once this fiscal note, the final formal fiscal note appeared, I was in support of Senator Dibble's motion to send the bill to the Finance Committee for hearing. This fiscal note showed up, I think, late Friday. And we had the motion yesterday, Monday. We weren't in session Saturday. So the moment we got the fiscal note, we took action on it to have it sent to the Finance Committee.
Well,
Senator Dibble.
And Mr. Chair, I'll just note for the record that preliminary fiscal note was requested under the auspices of Senator Limmer. It was released to him privately without being released to anyone previously. It was discovered in Rules Committee. Senator Limmer, I'm guessing, would have had plenty of opportunity since the release of the preliminary and the final to ask MMB to do something different with it. Mr. Chair, I do want to, as long as we're on the subject of putting information out, I do want to have a study distributed. It doesn't really relate to the fiscal note, and we don't do dynamic scoring, but I have a handout just so folks can understand that there are two sides of this ledger, and this is some research that shows there's some actual benefit to our larger economy if we're to pass this bill into law. It comes from the Williams Institute, and it shows just from the activity of folks getting married, weddings, additional weddings that will occur in Minnesota, that there will be $42 million boost to the local economy just in the first few years, with $27 million in the first year alone. So I just want to make sure that people are aware of that.
We're having information distributed. Senator Dibble, can I just go back to your comment relative to Senator Limmer's line of questioning and the discussion of fiscal notes? To be fair to Senator Limmer, I mean, the problem we have, and this is, I'll tell you as chairman of the Finance Committee, we had this discussion over these last several years. One of the frustrations, and this is not to blame the executive branch at all, this is just the reality of maybe the legislative sessions, that we're here for a relatively short duration. We introduce bills in January, February, March. We inundate the executive branch with requests for fiscal notes, and so in terms of Senator Limmer producing the fiscal note in final status when it showed up in the Rules Committee, I'm not sure that's Senator Limmer. I mean, it's just kind of what happens with these fiscal notes. I will note with the fiscal note that several agencies have reviewed this. I think the fiscal note was requested at, Mr. Chairman, you knew the date. It was
Mr. Chairman, the original fiscal note request was March 12th.
Okay, so that's a couple months ago, and if you look at the fiscal note, you'll see all the agencies that have reviewed this, and that's just the nature of a process that I just have come to the conclusion, because I've had this discussion with three previous administrations, that this is a process where the fiscal note process and the work that the executive branch has to do just does not intersect very well with a legislative session of shorter duration. That's just the reality. So I'm sorry, Senator Dibble, I offered my kind of editorial comment on the fiscal note process.
So, Mr. Chair, there is some discussion about revenue, additional revenue, if you wanted to hear about that from Ms. Weber.
Ms. Weber?
Mr. Chair and members, in addition to the cost that Minnesota Management and Budget has identified, we have also identified an increased revenue to the general fund. In fiscal year 14, that would be $190,000, and then in fiscal year 15 and beyond, it is estimated to be $10,000. That's based on the increase in the number of marriage licenses issued. The fiscal year 14 number is higher because of the expectation that there would be a higher demand for same-sex marriage licenses in the first year.
Senator Ingebrigtsen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to finish the point on the point you're making with Senator Limmer. And in fairness to Senator Limmer, not quite so much fairness to you, Mr. Chair, is my point. And my point is that, yes, in fact, this has been on the radar for a long time, this session. And I'm quite surprised that it would be brought forward without having everything covered. I mean, we're talking a major piece of legislation here in the state of Minnesota, and we don't know what the dissolution of marriages is going to cost the state of Minnesota. We don't know a number. I did see a number someplace, but I did serve on the Judiciary Committee where we talked about judiciary budget, judiciary issues like this, and why they wanted increases and why they don't want it, you know. And part of that is because of family court, and family court does cost money, and I'm quite surprised that we're not having that number brought before us as part of the fiscal note, with so much time that has lapsed since March. And I know the chair has been over the years very, very critical, at least the last 2 years, and when he was in the minority, about us not having fiscal notes complete. And this is certainly not complete on such a major piece of legislation.
Well, Senator Ingebrigtsen, let me do a little bit of arithmetic for you. Senator Dibble has had distributed this estimating the economic boost of marriage equality. What it indicates is we predict that approximately 4,946 in-state same-sex couples would choose to marry in the 3 years. So if hypothetically we assume 3 years, we would have the same number per year. That's approximately 1,500 plus couples that would marry in a single year. If we assume a divorce rate over those years at a high would be 20%. That would suggest 300 divorces, which I might add would take place in a subsequent biennium, we assume. 10 judicial districts, that would be 30 divorces per judicial district. I don't think you would see any need for new judgeships based on those numbers. Now, if you have some better statistics you can offer the committee, fine, but otherwise it's a sheer hypothetical.
Mr. Chair, I guess I really didn't realize that we were moving forward in this committee with that much of a hypothetical. I just, we've always been about numbers here, and you've made it very clear that that's the way we should be focused, but I guess we can throw hypotheticals out there. I would think that 30 cases per district is going to cost some money. And that just should be simply figured in here. That has nothing to do with the merits of the bill. Don't get me wrong. It's just the fiscal aspect.
Senator Ingebrigtsen, as a practitioner in the courts, I can't believe 30 cases would cost any money. Senator Bonoff.
Mr. Chair, Senator Ingebrigtsen, I have never heard, as we've looked at what the overall judiciary budget is, that we have gone to our religious institutions and asked them how many marriage certificates that they've given out, and then asked our MMB to calculate based on how many people get a divorce, whether or not they have an adequate supply of judges, and therefore whether or not we've appropriately budgeted for the judiciary. I think if we were looking at all of the various things that cost our society and that cost the courts, we would do a much different kind of budget analysis. We don't ask the schools how many, kids are getting in fights to determine whether our juvenile detention centers are, meeting the needs. There are different ways that we look at what our forecasted expenses are, and this is certainly not one of them that I've ever heard of.
Senator Ingebrigtsen.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, to that point, that's exactly what we do here in the legislature. We don't go to the clergy and ask them for those kinds of things. We go to our we're talking about certainly some revenue coming in here. We're open to the revenue coming in with this bill. We're not open to what the cost could be. And again, I go back to this being a very, very major piece of legislation that's moving forward without having those hypothetical costs. I guess we're going with hypothetical costs to the judiciary. I just think it's
well, Senator Ingebrigtsen, we've discussed the fiscal note and all the rest of it. Fiscal notes are not based upon hypotheticals. Senator Dibble.
Mr. Chair, the fiscal note has a little bit of data. So every year there's about 17,500 filings for divorce. And remember, people pay money that goes into the general fund for divorce filings. And the fiscal note anticipates 80-some additional divorces might occur as a result of same-sex couples being able to get married. I'd like to think that everyone falls in love and gets married for life, and that's certainly true in most cases. And believe me, in my community, it's, we can overcome long odds to get together and commit our lives to one another. So I'm guessing we'll get divorced in fewer numbers, but that's an editorial. So, when we're talking about in the context of 17,500 divorces, adding another 80-some divorces to that, which, by the way, pay money for divorce filing fees, we're arguing over de minimis numbers.
And legal fees, too.
We're probably spending more money sitting here talking about this than we would in whatever cost might incur from 80-some divorces out of almost 18,000 divorces per year.
Sir Nino.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm having deja vu. Mr. Chair, you refused to move a bill out of this committee. You pulled it back and had a reconsideration because of a, to quote the chair, sheer hypothetical cost of maybe a few $100s.
Senator Nino, I don't believe I said sheer hypothetical.
Well, no, you did about a minute ago. I was quoting that. And maybe it would have been better to quote you in the context of here we are now with a, quote, sheer hypothetical cost of maybe a few $100s.
I used the word sheer.
Well, you can listen to the tape, Mr. Chair. You did. And if one clerk has 1 hour of overtime, or 2 or 3, we're going to get up to the same level of cost that was theoretically associated with my amendment that was on a bill that you refused to let out of this committee. But yet now here you are arguing that it's no big deal because it's a sheer hypothetical. Mr. Chair, I'm just wanting to call that to your attention and ask that you act consistently here in this same committee.
And Senator Nino, I thought the phrase sheer hypothetical you were using relative, that I used that relative to your amendment. You're right, I didn't use that phrase relative to this
Yes.
debate.
Not
You're correct.
You're correct.
Senator Newman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I may, I'd like to ask a question on the fiscal note itself. This is a 30-some page fiscal note, so and I freely admit I have difficulty reading them. So on page 18, there is a fiscal note regarding the public employees' retirement that reflects no fiscal impact. And all it says on the next page is, we do not believe this bill would have any measurable cost to Public Employees Retirement Association. And if I flipped back to page 30, and that deals with work comp. And again, there's no fiscal implications, and under assumptions, there is a reference near the top that talks about an employee's spouse may be entitled to dependency benefits. So I'm trying to group this question into sort of a lump sum. When folks get married, spouses are entitled to dependency benefits. It may be through retirement, it could be through work comp. And so my question is, of either Senator Dibble or the two testifiers, why would there not be additional costs to the state of Minnesota if we are including this group of folks who will get married, and potentially the spouse would be entitled to benefits either from work comp or retirement or something along those lines?
Senator Dibble or Mr. Morocco?
Yeah, I'll defer to my testifiers.
Ms. Weber?
Mr. Chair and Senator Newman, if you look at the Public Employee Retirement Association, so I'm looking at page 18 and page 19 where they indicated there's no fiscal impact. Traditionally on the fiscal note process, we would allow an agency to indicate there wasn't a fiscal impact and not describe the reason or rationale why. So this is a case in which a good explanation of why there's not a cost is not defined. But if you look at some of the other retirement associations,
excuse me, could you go back to the explanation of why it's not there?
So
I didn't follow you, I'm sorry.
Previously, and this gets a little technical, the system that we had would just allow an agency to indicate there's no fiscal impact, and then they don't have to provide an explanation. We have asked agencies and instructed them to provide an explanation. In this case, they just indicated they don't believe there is a fiscal impact. So I would need to contact the agency to understand specifically why. However, if you look at the Teachers Retirement Association...
Excuse me, before you go, Mr. Chairman, would it be possible for you to go back and get us an explanation as to why? And that is the note that I've got written, is why. How come there isn't any kind of an explanation as to why there is no fiscal impact? If you could do that, I would appreciate it. And then go ahead and move on to the rest of my questions.
Mr. Chair and Senator Newman, yes, well, I can certainly follow up on that for you. If you look at page 22 and 23, for example, TRA describes in their assumptions why they believe that's the Teacher Retirement Association, why they believe, because they already have an ability to designate who would be the recipient of benefits. If you look at the Minnesota State Retirement System, which is on page 24 and 25, also under their jurisdiction, current law allows, this is the second paragraph under the cost to Minnesota State Retirement System on page 25, that it allows for it to be built in already if the employee were to die. And so they don't believe that there is a cost to expand the provision, that it's negligible for them, so they have not quantified a cost. And then going to your question about the Department of Labor and Industry with the workers' comp provision, so this is back on page 31 of the fiscal note. They have indicated in their explanation that the number of deaths is at such a low rate, and so then if you apply that to the number of same-sex couples, that they don't believe that there would be an explicit cost.
Mr. Chairman, just an observation, and I really do appreciate your explanation. And candidly, when I look at the fiscal note, overall, we are really not dealing with a great deal of money, assuming the assumptions of the various state agencies are correct. I am just simply a little surprised that we see language in here that indicates we're automatically going to cover a new group of people under state retirements and work comp, et cetera, and that there is no cost to the state of Minnesota. It just surprises me when I see that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Further questions or discussion? Senator Peterson.
Mr. Chair, were you moving towards a bill or just on the fiscal note?
Well, the discussion in committee is on the fiscal note, so whatever you'd like, Senator Peterson.
I have some questions for Senator Dibble on the bill when we're done with the fiscal note.
Well, again, I'd like to be careful again. We've had bills in front of the committee. We've a lot of discussion on what's in the bill, but the issue here is the fiscal note. But Senator Peterson, go ahead.
Okay, so Mr. Chair, I mean, I guess should I interpret that as that you wouldn't want any questions about individual rights or religious liberty, that kind of thing? You don't want those questions in this committee?
I guess I would. I think the preference is not to get too far afield, but certainly if you have a couple of questions that you'd like to ask Senator Dibble, feel free to do so.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Senator Dibble, I have not been in a committee where you've presented this bill in the past. That's kind of where my questions came from, and I had not read it until last night and this morning, and so there's a couple things I was hoping to clarify, and I can see in the bill you've done some significant work on the religious liberty side, which I think folks appreciate. But from your perspective, do you believe that individuals or sole proprietorships, those types of businesses, should be able to choose, who they do business with? And of course, the issues we've seen in the news relating to, specific marriages in the industry of planning weddings and that type of thing. And I'd be interested in your opinion on that, and then where in the bill that you think that's addressed in terms of that choice or that freedom. Or
Senator Dibble.
So, Mr. Chair and Senator Peterson, thank you for the question, the opportunity to respond. The goal of the bill is not to extend new privileges or rights that are not already provided for, except for the obvious one, of course, to let folks get married, nor inhibit any existing rights and freedoms that folks have. And so you see, of course, in the language of the bill, a lot of text that reaffirms a lot of what's already true, that religious associations and religious belief and religious practice in all the manners and forms that are currently provided for and protected in society, in our system of government, in our laws, and our Constitution, already exist. The question you ask is, should there be a new right to deny services to folks based on who they are? And the bill does not provide for that. And it's really not about who can get married, it's about who people are. So really, the question to ask yourself is, where would we stop? Where would we draw that line? I mean, there was a time when Catholic bakeries refused service to Lutheran weddings. I mean, so the same principle applies. Where would we draw that line? We have specific prohibitions against discrimination in our Human Rights Act. We have very, very strong, some of the strongest protections in our Human Rights Act for folks to practice their religious beliefs, for religious societies and organizations and faith traditions to carry out their practices, even beyond the walls and the confines of their sanctuary, reaching into their extension of services to the public in the nonprofit sector when those are a clear and direct function of their religious tradition, with their own resources. But when you're in the public sphere and you're a restaurant, you don't get to put a sign up in the window that says Irish people can't come in. So that's the operating principle in this bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Peterson.
Mr. Chair and Senator Dibble, a follow-up on that specifically then for the religious freedom aspect. I see that here towards the end of the second, or towards the bottom of page 3 there. And one concern I'm continuing to hear from constituents relates specifically to that religious organizations that might be more educational or more social, maybe is a word, or actually healthcare type services. Obviously, hospitals that have a religious foundation and have quite frankly, their bylaws and that type of thing that require they have agreements with various religious organizations to conduct themselves in a certain way. Or actually, another example might be a traditional religious college where they might not want to open up their married student housing to same-sex couples and that type of thing. Do you feel like your bill addresses those types of things?
Yeah. Mr. Chair, Senator Peterson, yes, a religious college, that's some of the protections we have in the Minnesota Human Rights Act. That's a little more extensive than you might find in a lot of other states. So housing, even employment at religiously affiliated institutions, is protected. They can decline to hire, they can decline to house folks based on that basis.
Mr. Chair, one last question. I basically on the last page of the bill on page 4, lines 4, 6, and 7, relating to those religious institutions, it says if association, corporation, society, or educational institution does not receive public funds. So that, when I was reading through the bill, a note I wrote down here was like the student grant program. So, in a case where a student in Minnesota might get a student grant, would they be able to use that at a traditional religious institution or college?
Thanks,
Senator Dibble.
Mr. Chair. I believe, and I'll need an attorney to help me with this, but I believe in the case of the student grant, those dollars are considered to come to the student and not to the institution per se. So the religious college is still able to operate with a great deal of latitude.
Great, thank you.
Further questions from the committee on Senate File 925. Senator Newman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Dibble, on page 4 of the bill, at line 8, there's a section on rules of construction. And my question has to do with various references throughout Minnesota statutes concerning marriages and spouses. There would be, for instance, specific statutes on inheritance and probates and divorces and marriage and all kinds of things sprinkled throughout our statutes here in Minnesota. Have you had any conversation at all with the reviser of statutes as to whether or not or what the cost would be to go through our statutes and incorporate this bill so that the appropriate language is contained?
Mr. Chair, Senator Newman, this language doesn't require the statutes themselves to have language changes, but it simply, as I understand, provides direction. The goal of this language is to ensure that folks who are married and have kids, for example, in the marriage and have a relationship, a parenting relationship to those kids, in the marriage, just by can't, and then in the event of a dissolution, aren't able to shed themselves of their ongoing and continuing responsibilities to those kids. That's really the goal of this language. It was brought in as we thought through some of the potential implications. I view this as, again, establishing, I don't think this language is entirely necessary, but is really to send a clear indication that folks, just by virtue of gender, are still have the responsibilities that they continue to maintain in the event of a dissolution, especially with respect to kids.
Senator Newman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Senator Dibble. And I do understand what you're talking about with reference to the rules of construction. And I think that you are correct, that these kinds of language changes would have to be taken into consideration. But this particular subdivision just brought to mind or made me wonder, I guess, as to whether or not anyone has discussed with the reviser of statutes the cost of what it would be to go through our statutes to bring it up to date. I know that there is a reviser's bill that comes forward during every session, and I am assuming that the reviser's bill is not free. It takes state employees to bring our statutes up to date, and I'm just wondering if you've had any conversations with the reviser on that issue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Senator Newman, I have not, because I haven't even contemplated undertaking a project like that. I would assume it would be pretty expensive, a few tens of thousands of dollars. I haven't contemplated that. I do know that Washington State, I think, just revised its statutes to get rid of old terms that refer to people in certain ways and gender terms and that sort of thing. Major project that was many years in the making. I just read about that, I think, in Governing Magazine a few days ago.
Senator Newman, if it's any comfort to you, it's my understanding from work with the reviser over the years that when a legislative session is finished, there's always some kind of updating. And my guess is that this bill would require significantly less updating of the statutes than a lot of the other things we do session after session. But I think as a matter of normal course, the reviser is prepared to do that no matter what happens during a legislative session.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I agree with you. I mean, as a matter of course, that's, of course, why we have the reviser's bill that comes forward. My concern on this bill is that this is a significant change, in Minnesota law, and of all of the relationships that are contained within our statutes, those of spouses and the married relationship really does carve out special laws, throughout all of our statutes. And that was the reason why I was asking the question, because this might likely be a bigger undertaking than normal for the reviser of statutes. And that's simply why I was asking the question, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chair.
Senator Limmer.
Mr. Chair, Senator Newman, you're bringing up perhaps the rules of construction, and it probably means that there's more than just stylistic changes. I'm more concerned about the substantive changes and substantive changes that could be affected in law and the consequential costs that have not been truly discussed. Now, maybe it's impossible to consider the substantive changes that this law would affect. Case law, I'm not sure how it would affect. Does it affect the costs of the courts? Apparently, there's no costs if we listen to this discussion. But I think there will be, and I think there's probably no real way except over time to consider how costly this would be. Just changing, you and I both know that having served in Judiciary Committee, we wrangle around with the definite consequences of how we frame and how we write law and how it's affected in our courts. what advantage to one side or another could be affected if we miss a particular tense on the writing of law. So there will be not only a cost to a reviser, but I think that would pale in consideration of what the cost would be on how it affects case law and how it affects other aspects of a judiciary budget. And unfortunately, we don't have that analysis in front of us. That remains an unknown.
Senator Sieben.
Mr. Chair, I think we've covered this, but this topic, but to Senator Newman, I just remind you of the governor's State of the State address, where he talked about the next legislative session actually going through the statutes and revising outdated language. So I would think that if this bill passes, this could be something that could easily be included in that initiative that the governor has already talked about. I think he called it the unsession. Yeah. If you recall.
Okay. Further, Senator Limmer.
On that point, Senator Sieben, then would you consider that perhaps the reference of wife or husband be considered outdated now? Because that's really what we're considering.
Mr. Chair. And Senator Limmer, I was just suggesting that if there are changes made this legislative session, that our statutes need to be updated to reflect those changes in the next legislative session. There's already been discussion about making some of those changes, and that's what any changes that are made this session certainly could be incorporated into that.
Further discussion on Senate File 925. If there's no further discussion,
Mr. Chair, I'll move that Senate File 925 be recommended to pass and sent to the Senate floor.
Senator Westrom.
Well, Mr. Chair, do you anticipate when this may come up on the floor, or when this issue is going to come before us?
Senator Westrom, I would have no idea. We adjourn May 20th, so sometime before then. But you'd have to ask Senator Bach.
Well, just before we take a vote on it, Mr. Chair, I would urge members to vote against it. I think this is a very significant change we are about to invoke in our state if we were to pass this bill. I think it would be in our best interest to not pass this bill to the Senate floor, which is ready for action at any time, and I would speak against the proposal.
Thank you, Senator Westrom. Senator Ingebrigtsen.
Mr. Chair, just not a point of order, but I guess just a observation. We should have everybody here as we did yesterday. I would like not to see us to have to do a revote again. It's becoming the revote session, and I just don't want to do that again out of respect for Senator Dibble. So I think we're missing one, and I don't know where he is.
Senator Anderson has not been here for quite a while. I'm happy if somebody knows if he's coming, but he left, I think, after Senator Marty's bill and hasn't returned.
Mr. Chair, he hasn't decided his stance on this issue, so he's taking over. I'm just kidding.
Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair.
Senator Limmer.
Senator Anderson talked to me earlier before the hearing began, and he told me that he had other pressing business that he could not be here for the duration of this session. Let's go.
Yeah. Okay. Let's make sure the record notes an excused absence for Senator Anderson. I appreciate that, Senator Limmer. So understand that Senator Anderson is, based on Senator Limmer's comment, not available. We have Senator Dibble's motion in front of us that Senate File 925 be recommended to pass. So is there further discussion on the motion? If not, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed?
No.
Motion prevails. All right. The committee is adjourned until Monday morning, or tomorrow morning at 8:30.
Monday morning.